What Rick had asked me to visit with you about, and Dr. Hudson just visited with you, so I apologize I wasn't here for his presentation, but kind of where we are on the cattle side of things with the inventory and others. If any of y'all have cattle right now? Have you just turned off the DTN and the futures markets? Good. Otherwise, you're going to be stopping at the liquor store on the way home. They're punishing us right now. But, I just got to remember that this is September, and things don't usually look real good in September a lot of times. But we'll visit about that. Then Rick wanted me to visit with you a little bit about winter forage management and our cow herds. One of the items I'd like to bring up, though, that wasn't on the list, and it's important, has anybody heard of something or read about something called the VFD? That's not Volunteer Fire Department, okay? VFD is called the Veterinary Feed Directive. Are you familiar with that? Okay, did anybody in here raise pigs, whether it's to show them or otherwise, or chickens, turkeys, beef cattle, any kind of food animal? If you use any type of medicated feed items in your production program, and those would be feed items that contain antibiotics that would be of importance in human medicine, then within the next year, you will no longer be able to buy any of those medicated feed items over the counter. So give you for instance, a weaning ration or weaning feed that you might have bought in the past, the wean calves that contain, say, chlortetracycline, or you may know what is aureomycin or something along those lines. Today, you can buy that over the counter. As of December 2016, that's at the latest, you will no longer be able to buy that over the counter. It will require you to have essentially a prescription. It's going to be called an authorization from a veterinarian in order to be able to purchase and utilize those products in your operations. And once again, this applies to any food animal that we're talking about. So you need to be aware of that and what's going to be required. And one of the things that will be required in order to receive those authorizations is that you have what is called a veterinary client-patient relationship, or a VCPR. And that's actually something that's defined in the Code of Practice in the state regulations for practice of veterinary medicine. And that becomes important because that's always been there. But on these new authorizations and new regulations, there's going to be a bit more teeth put into it. And what a veterinary client-patient relationship means is that if I need to purchase something from that veterinarian has to be more than my friend from church or the Lions Club. Okay, they have to have knowledge of my operation. They have to have been on my premises. They have to work with me in order to establish, and they have to demonstrate that, justify or demonstrate that there's a VCPR in place for them to write these authorizations. So if you use any of those medicated feed items, and when I say medicated feed items, there's a class that doesn't fit in there. If you feed Rumensin or Bovatec or another one called Gain Pro to your cattle, those are antimicrobials, but they are of no importance to human medicine, so they're not included on the list. It's things such as chlortetracycline, penicillin, oxytetracycline, these compounds that you can put in feed that will become under the professional supervision of a veterinarian. I believe the words the FDA is using on this. So if you're not aware of that, become familiar with it. Again, you've got somewhere probably 4 to 12 months before this really becomes in place on those over-the-counter medicated feed items. So in that time period, if you don't have a vet-client-patient relationship, have that established and then work through it. And these are going to work, the authorizations and the orders will work essentially like a prescription does. When you go to the doctor, they write you a script. You go to the pharmacy, you hand the pharmacy the script, or else the doctor calls it in for you, one of the two. And you will receive a bottle of pills, in your case, that has so many days of pills, and it'll say, can you have refills or no refills on it. And this is essentially the same thing that's going to work on this. How many head of cattle, in the case of cattle, how many head of cattle will be treated, how long, or what is the expiration date on this authorization. So once again, there's a date put on there that you can no longer use that authorization. Then duration of treatment, how many days will you use the medicated feed items to treat said animals and so forth, all has to be outlined. And then that has to be presented to the, whether it's a feed store, feed manufacturer, whoever to deal with in order to obtain those feed items. So if you need that, if you need to know about that, become more familiar with it. Okay, on the beef herd, see if I can make this work. I think everybody's seen this graph before. Total cattle inventory in the U.S. Once again, this is total inventory: beef cows, dairy cows, feedlot cattle, everything. And once again, you can see that 2014 we kind of bottomed out, and based on the prognosticators, they are suggesting that we may have one of the fastest recoveries that we've seen in history in terms of building some cattle numbers back up again. Once again, the current action in the cattle market may dampen some people's spirits a bit. I mean, I think it was yesterday, if a person wanted to, they could buy 500-pound heifers for $1.90 if you wanted to, which that's a lot different than what it was even 4 months ago. So that may dampen some spirits. But once again, we still have a relatively low cattle inventory. We are starting to build back up. You'll see part of that's recovery from the drought. Part of it in this part of the world, as well as in other parts of the world, has to do with the commodity markets that you heard about previously. The corn market, some of those have had a nice run for about the last 7 years, and now things are changing, and they're looking at how to reallocate some of their resources. And beef cattle is one thing that looks inviting to some people. At least the cow-calf industry looks inviting. Again, this is a beef cow inventory, so break it out. Once again, you can see where we picked up, starting to expand. Once again, that number popping like it did from around 29 million up is a fairly large increase on a year-over-year basis in that case. And the question becomes, and I'll show you some prognostications here in a moment, is what does that look like on out in front of us? How quickly is that going to build back up, and how far will it build back up? Replacement heifers, you can see that if you want to talk about expansion or rebuilding or whatever you want to call it, that this didn't start last year. If you look at the replacement heifers, $1 million a head, you can see back in 2012 we actually started picking up on replacement heifers. Part of that was cows that were going into retirement and being replaced. But you can see steadily over the last 4 years those numbers have picked up, and we had a large increase last year of 230,000 head. Again, part of that's in tune with the fact that in Texas, where we lost 1 million head of cattle due to the drought, they moved out or went to the Golden Arches, or New Mexico lost cattle, Oklahoma lost cattle, Kansas lost a significant number of cattle due to the drought. Part of that's restocking those areas, picking those cattle numbers back up. But again, that's not something that just recently started. And as you know, as we continue to keep more heifers back, what does that do to the number of calves that are on the market? If more heifers stay home to become cows, how many feeder heifers are out on the market for somebody to buy? Fewer. So that supports price. I don't know that we've seen that yet, and as much murkiness as there is in the markets right now, I don't know that we'd be able to ferret it out, because there's a lot of things moving around right now in the commodity markets and outside markets that are affecting the cattle market. Calf crop, you can see we've started to elevate the calf crop. I just want you to think about this. In 1995, we had a 40.3 million head calf crop. We dropped that down to 33.7 million. How big of a drop's that? About 20, somewhere between 20 and 25% roughly. We dropped the calf crop. Now we're starting to look like we're going to walk it back out again. These numbers, I know people look at them, and unfortunately, I think some of the markets depend on them. I question how accurate some of this is. And any of y'all that are in the grain markets know how some of the USDA projections are. But basically, if you look at these numbers, they're basically figuring we get an 86% calf crop every year, is what that looks like. So, but if we start to walk back up again, is once again, how far will we push this up? And then what will that do to prices on those calves? And I think that's everybody's ultimate question, is what's that do to prices on calves as we move back up again? You know, if we move back up in the neighborhood of say 35 million head calf crop, does that mean we're reverting to prices that were present in 2009? I don't know. I should have had Dr. Hudson on here after me to answer that question. The thing that's occurred over that time period that we need to realize is we went from say 35.9 in 2008, suffered through the throes of the corn market, depleted our calf crop down to 33.7. We've also set new planes in the box beef market. We have significantly moved the price of box beef up. We moved the price of beef in the retail industry up. And once those prices move up higher in the retail industry, they don't come down near as quickly or near as rapidly as we see things come down out here in the country. So will the prices as we move calves up revert back to 2008? Well, the question becomes, is the box beef market going to revert back to 2008 levels, or are we going to be able to hold those levels in the box beef market, which is going to support, even at the same calf crop level, will support higher calf prices potentially, if we can hold box beef. I don't know if anybody can remember, but 2008, I think we were probably trading box beef somewhere under $2. I can't remember that far back, but it's probably $1.80, $1.90, $2, somewhere in that neighborhood. And again, today we're trading box beef at $2.30, $2.35. So we would have to have a significant backup on the box beef market. In fact, that's one of the frustrations right now in part of the cattle, especially on the fed cattle side of things. At the levels we're trading box beef today, we should be trading cattle at 148 to 150 out of feed yards, and we're trading it at 140. And part of that is we've got some areas of the country that we have a lot of what I call rotten tomato cattle. Over the last year or two, we have held cattle and held cattle and held cattle in the feed yards because you make more money holding those cattle for a longer period of time rather than selling them and buying one to replace them, if that makes sense. If cost of gains $1 to $1.10 on those big fat cattle, and I can still sell them for $1.45 or $1.50, I'm making money holding them, versus turn around and replacing them with an animal that's automatically a $100 a head loser the day I buy them. So, but what happens on that is it's just like tomatoes in the produce counter at the grocery store. You can only keep those tomatoes in that produce counter so long before you have to move them. And we've got some cattle around that are very, very large, and they've hit the end of where we can take them, especially up in the Midwest. They've got some cattle moving up in the Midwest that are weighing 1,600, 1,700 pounds coming out of feed yards up there, and they just, you can't take them any further. And so part of our doldrums right now in the fed cattle market is we've got an excessive supply of big fat cattle in other parts of the world. It's not necessarily down here, but the way the fed cattle market works, whatever happens up north affects us down here, and that's part of what we're suffering through right now. But again, the question becomes, how fast will this calf crop build back up, and what will occur to prices as we move up? Feeder cattle outside of feed yards, you can see moving those numbers up. That provides some relief. If you look at some of the adjustments occurring right now in the markets, everything's kind of adjusting down, but we're probably taking a little more out of the feeder cattle market than we have out of the calf or the fed cattle markets here lately. If you look over, again, back over the last year or 2 years, if you had to say is something out of whack in the cattle supply chain, it's probably been feeder cattle prices. Because on average, you could buy a light calf put them out on wheat, put them out on grass somewhere else, take them to 750, 800 pounds, make $100 a head or $150 a head on them, take that same animal and put them in the feed yard, and you're going to give all that back. So that probably tells you that the feeder cattle have been a little bit out of whack, and part of that is, as our cattle numbers have drawn down, we got more feedlot space than we do feeder cattle, and we bid those cattle up. And that's when we're seeing some of the adjustments that we're seeing now. This is the July 5th, or July 1st report. You can compare 14 to 15 just to see where we were. Again, numbers here, beef cows at a calf have gone up about 2.5% year over year. Beef replacement heifers, again, that looks like a big percentage, but if you think about that, that's 300,000 extra beef replacement heifers that were kept back in the country this year. You know, 300,000 on 30 million beef cows is what percentage? 1%. So that number looks big, but it's not near as big as it could be if you wanted to put it that way. It does pull cattle off the market, which supports the calf prices. Once again, you can see calf crop picking up a bit, about 400,000 head increase in calf crop this year compared to last. So, for 1.2%. So we hit that bottom, and it looks like we're going to build back up unless we have some other anomaly come into play. And there's some of those things hanging out there that could be anomalies that stall this thing out, such as the current situation of calf prices being deflated. Also, some concerns on weather that have we just had a really nice year in the middle of a series of dry years, and there's some climatologists that are talking about that, but I don't want to visit about that today. We'll enjoy what we have. Okay, let's look at some forecasts. This is out of LMIC and Dr. Darrell Peel at Oklahoma State University. You know who Dr. Peel is. But you can see here's beef cow inventory bottoming out, looking at a forecast here of moving back up, and Dr. Peel's of the opinion that probably, I don't know what he called it, market equilibrium, or things the way things should be, that we probably ought to be sitting at about 31 or 32 million beef cows. We're currently at about 30. And if we had not had the drought problems in Texas and Oklahoma and everywhere else from 2007 on up through now, that we probably would have never gone below about 30 million or 31 million. We would have stayed up at that level. And if you think about that, Texas lost about 1 million head of cows during the drought. If we hadn't had a drought in Texas, we wouldn't have dropped to 29 million something cattle in the U.S. because those 1 million head of cows would still be out here. And New Mexico wouldn't have lost their cows, and Oklahoma wouldn't have lost theirs. So the drought pushed this thing down further than it was going to go anyway. And if you remember back to 2006, you may not, we tried, you can look right here, kind of a blip. There was a period there when it looked like we were retaining heifers and fixing to start building a herd back up again in 2006, and that stalled out because we decided we need to burn ethanol in our cars. That was part of it. But beef production, again, we've still got a couple of years here where we're going to be at low beef production, which is going to support those prices, or tend to support them. But on the other side of that, on our competing meats, we've got pork and chicken that we've got a lot of supply. And you saw the dollar situation, or an example of the international dollar value that Dr. Hudson showed you using something like wheat. The same thing occurs in these food markets. And if we've got a lot of poultry sitting here that suddenly chicken legs cost a lot more in Russia coming from the U.S. than they do from somewhere else, well, we get to eat those chicken legs in the United States. And that creates a supply here in the States that competes against our beef supply. And the same thing occurs on the beef market. Dollar value goes up. Japan looks they can buy beef from Australia for less money than they can buy it from the U.S. Our export market's deteriorating. And so whether these low beef supplies are going to continue to keep prices up or not, it's something we've got to see what falls out with the dollar. Again, this is Dr. Fields' forecast. Took from him, you can see him bottoming out. He shows where, between now and about 2000 or 2020, 2021, building back up somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 million, 32.5 million beef cows. So I took those numbers of his and estimated out that this should be calf crop. So if beef cow numbers pick up like Dr. Fields' estimates do, this would be what our calf crop would look like on a national basis. So you can see if we build back up in 2021 up to his levels, and the thing you've got to remember here, you say, well, if we have 32 million beef cows, how can we have 36 million calves? Remember that calf crop includes the dairy herd in here, okay? So as we build the cow numbers, beef cow numbers back up, then that would say we may elevate back up here to around 36 million head calf crop. So the question becomes, do we revert to prices like we had back when we had a $36 million head calf crop back in 2006 or 2007? Anybody remember what calf prices were in 2006 or 7? I can't. I think they were somewhere about $1.40 on a 5-weight calf, somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know that we're going to drop down that low. That's the unknown. And I'm a nutritionist, not an economist. So expansion mode appears to be going. How high will it go and how fast, we don't know on this. There's some economic factors that may dampen it. There's some weather factors that may dampen it. Other external export market factors. If anybody's looked at the drought monitor lately, have you looked at what it looks like southeast of I-35? It looks like it did a couple of years ago on the drought monitor. So that's back to the weather end of things. Are we back to where we're going to be not in a drought, but drier than what we expected it to be? In fact, I think some of those counties, I'm not sure, may have been declared disaster counties already. But so if you're looking for some cheap cows, you might send somebody to southeast Texas, and you might start picking some up here in a month or two when the hay supply runs out. Prices. We're going to have fewer calves on the market because we're retaining heifers. That's going to tend to support the calf price. Again, the other question is how fast will those numbers increase and how will that affect calf prices? Our commodities have softened. We're pulling those commodity prices back in line to where they used to be. That supports calf prices. But that's also if we can make things improve out on the other end on the fed beef side of things. Calf demand, how much demand will there be for the calves? That will affect prices. And that should say stop. So will adjustments stop the bleeding in the feedlot sector? It's still pretty severe up at that level on losses that they're taking right now. And I know some, I don't know all, but they finally hit the end of the rope and said, these pens may be making more money with weeds growing in them than cattle growing in them. And as you pull that demand off that calf market, it softens those calf prices. Beef demand, what's going to happen to exports and specifically that relationship with the U.S. dollar? How much does that weaken our export market? Or the other ways, how cheaply do we have to sell things in order to buy our way back into the export market or keep our share of the export market? And then the oil business, that may be a two-edged sword. The more the oil goes down, the more people are out on the unemployment lines or hunting a job, and that could affect their willingness to go eat steak at night or anything else. On the other hand, I don't know what gas prices are down in this part of the world, but in Amarillo we can buy gas for $1.88 right now. That's a full $1 cheaper than it was about this time last year. And if I'm burning 20 gallons of gas a week, that's 20 extra dollars I have in my pocket every week to go eat out or buy some beef to eat. So the two of those may offset each other. Okay, on feed, that's where I'm going to have to kind of go to talk off the cuff here. This is the part where I lost the presentation. Managing your winter feed resources. How has everybody's rainfall been this year? What's that, Rick?
Depends on which day.
I'm talking about right here. Floyd and Hale. Well, what was it before then? Okay, so you've had, what, above normal rainfall for the growing season? It's just a little bit dry right now. You grew a lot of grass. As a general rule of thumb, the more grass you grow, the lower the nutritional value of that grass is. Because you accumulate mass, and that mass dilutes out the nutritional value. So as we move into the fall and the winter on these stockpiled warm season forages, your rangeland that you may have stockpiled forage or some introduced pasture that you stockpile forage on to graze this winter, those are probably going to be at best average, but most likely below average nutritional value on those stockpile forages. Some of you may wonder how in the world that's going to happen because, you know, more rain, I grow more forage, but you got to remember there's a difference between growing forage and running a hay baler and cutting it every so often and maintaining quality versus the way we manage where we stockpile, we allow forage to grow and stockpile it so we can graze it through the winter months. As we stockpile it, the forage loses quality. So what is our if that's the case, we're going to have a more fibrous forage material and a lower protein value. So both the energy and the protein value will be lower. But our first priority is going to be to supply protein to the cattle because the bacteria and the rumen that digest it need the protein. There should be enough mass out there typically to take care of the cattle from an energy standpoint on a cow. So we can supply protein in a number of different ways. And that's where I think you can start looking around at things you could manage from a supplementation standpoint. Anybody grow alfalfa hay around here? Or anybody buy alfalfa hay? What's alfalfa costing right now? Sir? Well, evidently you've not been selling it then if you don't know. You haven't. Why have you been selling it? Because you're keeping it or you can't sell it? Both. That's a problem right now in the alfalfa market. There's a lot of alfalfa around, especially west of here, and they're having trouble selling it. And the dairies have become more picky than they have in the past. And the point is on that, as we look into potentially winter feed programs, I can buy alfalfa for $130, $140 a ton right now for pretty good alfalfa hay. And if you look at the protein in that, what we want to look at is we want to price, we're buying protein because that's what the primary thing we'll need with this grass, we're buying protein. I want to look at the dollars per unit of protein that I'm buying as my decision point. Well, if I can buy, let's say 20% protein alfalfa hay for 140 bucks a ton, I'm spending what, 140 divided by 7, I'm spending, what, $20 per unit of protein? Right? No, I'm spending 7. I got that back. $140 for 27. I'm spending $7 per unit of protein. If I go out and look at something like cottonseed meal that has, or cottonseed cake that's 38 or 40%, let's just use 40 because it's easy to multiply. If I can buy protein in alfalfa hay for $7 per unit of protein, cottonseed cake runs 40% protein, then I've got to be able to buy cottonseed cake for less than 280 bucks a ton in order to be a more competitive protein source than alfalfa hay would be. That also means on a 20% range cube, that's simple math. If alfalfa's got 20% protein and I can buy it for 140 bucks, I've got to be able to buy 20% range cube for $140 or less for them to outcompete that alfalfa hay. So as we look at these different options, things are lining back up, and I know alfalfa may not sound like something you want to feed, but that's just an example of things that are becoming a little less expensive and a way to look at what you might use as a protein source this winter. You know, whole cottonseed, it'll run 20% protein, and you're saying, well, if that's the case, I'll be able to buy whole cottonseed for 140 bucks a ton. No, that ain't gonna work because whole cottonseed also contains a lot of energy. And so it's going to be priced differently because of its energy value that's in there. But we've got a lot of different commodities available that are down here. But you can feed protein however you need to, but that's going to be our nutrient of first concern if you've got plenty of mass built up there out here on your pasture. Now, if you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of mass built up, or you've got a lot of heifers that you're trying to raise and have a calf out of the first time, we switch a little bit, and protein's a concern, but we'll also have to focus a bit on energy, because on those growing heifers, and those heifers fix the calf the first time, sometime in the next 10 months, they also need an extra energy source. We may have to revert back to, you can still use alfalfa hay and feed it at a higher level, but we may revert to 20% cube or whole cottonseed or something along those lines as we move. So I'd encourage you to look at your prices and see what they would be. On the small grain side of things, going through the winter, we can use those as a good protein source, and I want to emphasize that. You can graze mature cows full-time on wheat pasture if you want to, but in my opinion, that's like buying just tons and tons of 20% range cubes and pouring them out on the ground and letting the cows eat them, because that's a lot more nutrition than that cow needs. If I turn a cow out on wheat pasture full-time, I'm talking about a mature cow, I turn her out on wheat pasture full-time in the height of lactation, so at the highest level of nutritional stress on that cow possible, she's going to be gaining 2 or 3 pounds a day at the height of her nutritional stress. And that's fine if you want the cows to be like that, but that's a lot of excess nutrition. So if you want to look at wheat pasture or small grains, they're a good nutritional source, but logistically, if you could set that up and use that as a supplement rather than a full-time grazing program, it's going to be much more beneficial. If you look at a mature cow as an example, if you want to use wheat pasture or triticale, pick your forage, winter forage, as a cow supplement in the winter for mature cows, when she's in late gestation, that last 3 months leading up to calving, you can let her graze 1 day a week on wheat pasture, and she's going to consume enough of that wheat pasture and enough nutrients from that wheat pasture in that 1 full day of grazing to support her, and you turn her back out on your dormant stockpile forage the rest of the time, or cotton burrs or whatever else you're feeding the cow. As she moves into lactation, early lactation, she probably needs to be out there 2 days a week. Now, so on that's what we call limit grazing. If you can set it up, they've got access, and you go, well, I don't have to get out there and move them on and off and everything else. The way to think about this is if you go to the 1 day a week, really what you need to do is about 2 half days a week. So she'll fill up in about 4 hours out on that wheat pasture. So what you do if you want to work something like that is sow you some wheat next to your other grazing area, and don't put any drinking water out on the wheat. And so you open the gate the 2 mornings you want those cows to go out there and graze. They go out there and graze, and then about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning when they're thirsty, they're going to walk off that wheat pasture and go to water, and you can close the gate behind them or whatever. But there's systems like that to make work. And by doing that, 1 acre of wheat can support 4, 5, 6 cows all through the winter with 1 acre of wheat as a supplement, rather than buying range cubes or something along those lines. On a heifer, pregnant replacement heifer, I know people don't really like to use wheat pasture. It is a good way to put good nutrition into that heifer. I know some people claim it makes them too fat, but I will ask you this question: is McDonald's responsible for childhood obesity in the United States, or is it the parents of those kids that are responsible? So if your heifers are becoming too fleshy on wheat pasture, it's not the wheat pasture's fault. Okay, it's the manager's fault. They don't need to be out there full time, but you can use it as a supplement. It's especially beneficial once they've calved out and that heifer's continuing to grow. She's trying to produce milk and turn back around and rebreed for that next time. The wheat pasture becomes extremely beneficial at that time to turn those heifers back around. But again, how fleshy they are depends on how you manage it. And you can create some calving problems in those heifers at too high plain nutrition, but it's typically more of what I call a couch potato syndrome than it is big birth weights on calves. And that's because those heifers are out in a fairly nice environment. They're not having to walk very far. They can eat all they want, and they're not exercising very much. Versus a heifer that's out here on grass, native grass somewhere, she may be walking 2 or 3 miles a day back and forth around hunting. She's in a lot better physical condition. And so once she starts that birthing process, the heifer that's been on wheat may give up a little bit quicker because she's not in as good a physical condition, and you end up having to help her. And a lot of people say, well, I had to help her, so it must have been that big old birth weight on that calf. Well, it wasn't necessarily a big birth weight. It was she gave up or ran out of energy a little faster. But those are very valuable forages to use on those heifers. As we try to work on that, if you want to use those small grains as supplements for those cattle, bloat's going to become an issue, potentially at certain times of the year, especially if you're using a limit grazing program, because if you've ever run stocker cattle and had bloat problems, one of the times we have bloat problems is when those cattle go out and load up in front of a storm or they load up after a storm. If you think about a cow that's going to be limit grazing twice a week, what's she going to be doing when she hits that wheat pasture? Head down, loading up, because she knows she has 4 hours to take care of business out there. So you want to have some bloat protection on those cattle. And bloat guard or Remensin, one of these type products, can be very useful in that. From a heifer and a cow standpoint, you need to have a mineral supplement built for wheat pasture for small grains. And when I say built, that's a high calcium mineral because our small grains are marginal to deficient in calcium. Calcium deficiencies can cause tetany or muscle contraction. Typically, if you've kept up on your phosphorus fertilization programs, you typically have enough phosphorus in those small grains, but we have seen instances where phosphorus levels are marginal. But unlike a mineral supplement out here on range grass, we don't need 8 or 10% phosphorus in that wheat mineral. We need about 2, maybe 3 at most. On a calcium, we'll need, instead of having 8 or 10 calcium like we would on a range mineral, we'll have 13, 14, 15% calcium in that wheat pasture mineral. On cows and heifers that are going to be having a calf, we also need magnesium in there so we can avoid grass tetany. Magnesium is not a big issue on stocker cattle because grass tetany is a problem with lactating cows. I don't think you've got any lactating steers out there on wheat, okay? But so magnesium would be an issue that we play with when we talk about a cow program, and then within complete trace mineral program. The last thing I'll close with, if you're thinking about stocker cattle, given where we are on the markets, not knowing where we're going, but the thing that's been good the last few years in the stocker cattle market is the value of weight that we put on those calves is very high. We're running somewhere, the last 18 months to 2 years, the value of weight gain on a steer has been about $1.30 or $1.40 per pound of weight gain that added weight gain we put on it. We're still, even with the market originally like it is, we're still seeing values of $1 to $1.20 easily on value of weight gain. Just to give you an idea, at that level, it becomes very economical for us to be able to push those cattle some while they're on wheat pasture. And if the market looks like it's going down on us, we may want to push those cattle a little bit to build some margins into them. So just to give you an idea, if I've got cattle out on wheat pasture, stocker cattle, minerals become very important. Very good research out of Oklahoma. Cattle with no mineral versus cattle simply with a mineral supplement, an extra 1/4 pound a day weight gain, just with the mineral supplement. If your mineral supplement contains Remensin, that becomes a 1/2 pound increase in average daily gain. And if you use the value of weight gain on those cattle at say $1.30, I could pay $3,400 a ton for that mineral supplement and break even. So an $800 a ton mineral supplement is a moneymaker. If we go into other supplements like grain, if I feed a couple of pounds of grain to cattle while they're on wheat, if you wanted to do that, I can push my weight gain up 1/4 pound to 3/10 pound a day. I would have to be paying in excess of $500 a ton for that grain for that to not be a profitable program in today's world. So there's a way to push on those cattle a little bit, and in the times when we see the markets dropping, it may be beneficial for you to consider doing a little bit more than you've done in the past on some of those stock cattle. I'll leave it at that. Bill?